to take a break. We're going to plow on for our last closing speaker, and he's going to be introduced by the two International Association of Penal Law Book of the Year Award co-winners. So if you all will come up and introduce the esteemed Cherif Bassiouni, that would be terrific.
It actually takes two of us to introduce a man who needs no introduction. The distinguished research professor of law at DePaul, president of the International Human Rights Law Institute, Institute of Higher Studies in Criminal Sciences in Syracuse, Italy, multiple Nobel Peace Prize nominee, author and editor of 60 books and more than 200 articles, worked for the United Nations. Most recently, he was appointed by the UN High Commission for Human Rights as the independent expert on human rights in Afghanistan. And
I began teaching the same year as Cherif, 1964. And last week I had an absolutely new experience. A student asked me a stupid question. It was the first time it's ever happened to me. He came into my office and he said, "Do you know this Cherif Bassiouni fellow?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Have you read any of his stuff?" And I pulled 7 of Cherif's books off my shelves, 2 of them really beaten up because I've read them a lot. And I said, "Sure, I've read a lot of his stuff and I've learnt an enormous amount from it." And he said, "Well, how do you know him?" And I said, "I've always known him. There are some people you just know." And he said, "Well, tell me some stories about working with him." You can see I blew a whole afternoon on this. And I talked about our work on the International Criminal Court, Cherif as the chair of the drafting committee in Rome, and what a wonderful experience that was. And he said, "Well, what about the first time?" And I said, "Well, the first time we worked together was 20 years ago when we were in Ottawa and we were drafting what became the United Nations Declaration on Basic Principles of Justice for Victims of Crime and Abuse of Power." I managed to say that in one breath. And he said, "Well, tell me about it." I said, "Well, we took turns sitting at a desk that was once occupied by Pierre Elliott Trudeau." And I said, "I had incredible feelings of delusions of grandeur at this point." And he said, "God, feelings of delusions of grandeur when you sat at a chair that Bassiouni sat at." And I said, "Well, forget it." Cherif.
Well, thank you, Roger, Ellen. It's difficult to take the floor at such a late time of the day, and especially after we have heard so much today. This was an extraordinary conference, as I'm sure you'll all agree, and the credit, of course, goes to the speakers, but it also goes to the person who thought of it and conceptualized it and invited the speaker, and that's to Michael Cherif, and I think we really should give him a big round of applause. I must tell you that I was absolutely fascinated by all of the interventions that I heard here, and I had prepared a fairly scholarly presentation, but I've been wrestling all day with something which I shared with Amos before, and I hope you will forgive me, but let me share with you the difficult feelings I've had as I heard some of the speakers. My story starts as I came back from the Suez Canal war zone in 1956. I had been wounded in battle, and I was given a cushy job in the middle of Cairo. I was a training officer, and one night I was duty officer, and I heard a commotion. There was nobody in the camp other than me and a detail of 10 men guarding a load of military equipment. I went out to the gate and saw a few people running in a particular direction, asked the guard what was happening, and he said, well, somebody said that they sighted a plane, an Israeli plane had been shot down, and a paratrooper had fallen right behind the camp. And obviously that crowd was not running there to greet him with open arms. I was 19 and a half at the time. I had just returned from France, where I had completed 2 years of law school. I came from a family of lawyers, and I will confess to you that it didn't take me more than a few seconds before calling alarm, summoning my detail of 10 men, and running out in the street to try to beat the crowd to the Israeli pilot. It came instinctively. Fortunately, there were no planes shot down and no pilot. We came back. And in the naivete of a young second lieutenant who's not a career Army officer, I wrote down in the duty book, in the report book, that I had left my post and taken my entire detail outside the post. Next day, I was called back from home, where I had gone after my tour, and my commanding officer informed me that he had no duty but to have me court-martialed. My argument to him was that it would look awfully bad on the prestige of the Egyptian military if an Israeli pilot would have been killed by the mob just behind an Egyptian military camp. And he was a career officer, and he thought about it, and the idea of dishonor was to him more compelling than anything else. And so he called a sergeant, a technical sergeant, and he told him that there was something wrong with the book where you recorded this thing, because apparently ink had fallen. And at which point he pulled out an old-fashioned pen and emptied the ink on it, and it was illegible. And the report was rewritten, and I signed it as having had nothing occurring that evening. A few years later, I happened to be an advisor to President Sadat in connection with the Camp David agreements, and shortly thereafter I made friendship with a general who recently deceased, an Israeli general by the name of Abrash Tamir, and he was the Director General of Prime Minister Begin's office. And one day, as we were shooting the breeze, and we subsequently continued to work together until recently, when I was leading a Track 2 negotiating team of Israelis, Egyptians, Jordanian, and Egyptians on establishing a region free of weapons of mass destruction. Anyway, back in '78, I told him the story, and he said, well, you know, this is really why it was so easy for Egypt and Israel to have a peace agreement. At that time, the agreement wasn't signed. It was just the Camp David. He said, we could never do that with Syria. He said, we have 6 of our flyers who fell, 3 of them in the Golan Heights, who were tortured and killed. And he said, it would be very difficult for us to overcome that. And after a while, we started discussing it, and it was quite surprising to me of the impact of torturing POWs and torturing people in terms of the counterproductivity that it has in political terms. Well, the part that gets a little more difficult for me is a few years later. And that was in 1958. I had been selected or screened to serve in President Nasser's staff, the presidency. It took a little bit of time to vet out people in the process, so as I was being vetted out and I was frequenting the office of the presidency at the time, it was a way for other people to evaluate me on the job. One of the officers there showed me a picture, and the picture was of a man who was strapped in a chair, and he had a metal band around his head, and it had a screw, and as the screw turned, the head burst out, and you could see the brain coming out. And he said this was a leader of the Muslim Brotherhood who had been killed that way. And I have to tell you that at the time, the one thing that came to my mind, and I forgot who the author of it, was the prayer reportedly by a Protestant minister after World War II. And he said something to the effect that, well, they first came for the communists, and I wasn't a communist, so it didn't matter to me. I didn't speak up. And then they came for, and he kept going on, and they came for the Jews, and I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for the Catholics, and I wasn't a Catholic. And then finally, when they came for me, there wasn't anybody left to speak up. And the first thing that came to my mind, I'm not a Muslim brother. I've never been part of it, have no sympathy for it. And I thought to myself, well, somebody has to speak on his behalf. And I decided to find a way to crash what I knew was to be a cabinet meeting that day. The cabinet meeting was not presided by Nasser as was planned, but by the vice president. And I walked in and introduced myself, and one of those extraordinary quirks of fate. The vice president was the sort of titular commander of the Canal Zone area in '56. And after I came back from the front, I was awarded the Egyptian Medal of Honor, and he was present. And so, as it frequently happens when you have a senior person and a young second lieutenant, as I was the case, I was immediately my son and all of that. And so he remembered me, and of course took great pride in introducing me to some of the cabinet members as the fellow who commanded the first Egyptian line of defense outside Port Said to greet the Brits. Anyway, strong with that background, I pulled out the picture, and I said, do you know that this is happening, and you know this is being done in the name of the government and in the name of the revolution, and that this is illegal, etc., etc. At which point I got into an altercation with the deputy chief of intelligence, who was sitting behind the chief of intelligence, and the bottom line is, within a matter of 15 minutes, I was arrested. I was told for a period of time in which I was kept in a room that the decision wasn't made whether I'd be shot or taken to one of those places and tortured exactly in the same way as I had protested the torture of others. I must have died 1,000 times during those 6 hours. I was then taken to my apartment, and I was kept for 7 months in house arrest, not knowing what my fate would be. The shutters were nailed, the telephone lines were cut off, I had no radio, no contact with the outside world. Somebody brought food and left it somewhere on the table. And that was it. And so for 7 months, I didn't know what would be my fate. And my whole universe became my bed. I didn't even move out of my bedroom, let alone into my apartment, for the fear of what it would do to me. I don't think I've ever recovered from that trauma. And as years went by, and I chaired the Commission of Experts in the former Yugoslavia, I sort of relived all of that by interviewing and talking to people who had been tortured. And it's indescribable how you would be sitting with somebody who would show you their scars, or women who had been raped. And we interviewed 223 women who had been raped and tortured by the rape for months on end. And I have seen people who have been cut to pieces. Frankly, it's very hard to sit and listen to dispassionate arguments about the merits of torture, about the justification for torture, when you have seen what it does, when you have yourselves suffered from it. In the final analysis, you know, it really boils down to one very simple thing. It's values. It's about values. It will always be about values. And those values are simply the very basic human values, the values of a mensch. You either are or you aren't. And if you are, you cannot tolerate, justify, rationalize, accept torture in any fashion. And once you cross that line, you have crossed it. You cannot cross it mildly. You cannot cross it partially. You cannot say some torture is justified and some isn't. There is no way, after you get on that slippery slope, to try to stop it in any way. Now, this is not new. What we see now is what we have seen for centuries throughout history. If you look back at the 40 or so major civilizations in the last 7,000 years, you will find torture associated with almost every one of these civilizations. Torture in the context of war, torture for purposes of extracting information, torture for purposes of gaining some type of superiority, torture for purposes of inflicting humiliation upon those who are defeated. You will see that throughout history in the criminal justice system, for purposes of general investigation, for purposes of obtaining evidence, torture as means of punishment. And you see throughout all of that the same lines of justification which you hear today. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The justification, necessity, just desert, liability. These are the three main arguments that you have. Counter-argument on the policy level. Reliability. Physical torture is unreliable. How about chemical torture? How about truth serums? How about other techniques? Or maybe it's somewhat reliable, but it is counterproductive. And you have exactly the same arguments. What are the assumptions? Are the assumptions that public values are better upheld when it's done by government officials, or can we outsource our public value policies and other legal obligations to what we call non-state actors or privatization? What is the derivative impact on social values? Are we going to impart now the notion that torture is permissible, that it's a practice that we can emulate, that it's something that demonstrates the power that one human being has on another? How will that devolve within our society? For those who are interested on the military side, think a little bit about the notion of chain of command and control that we've heard so much. Will any officer be able to admonish any soldier after that officer had looked the other way when that soldier engaged in torture? Will you be able to give a direct order to a soldier not to steal after you've looked the other way when he has engaged in torture? What type of a discipline will you have in your armed forces? All of these fall in the types of arguments of reliability, justification, counterproductivity, legal assumptions, etc. But as you go through the range of arguments, as you go through the range of experiences, and you go through the historical experiences of all of our civilizations in the context of war and in the context of peace, you ultimately come down in the end to that essential question. It's all about human values. And the problem is that, to paraphrase George Santayana, those who forget the lessons of the past are condemned to repeat their mistakes. And how could we have forgotten the lessons of the past when it comes to torture, when it comes to such a fundamental human notion? How could we have forgotten the lessons of history which have shown at all levels what that means? And yet, we seem to have given that up. And we did that ignoring also what a great American patriot once said, Ben Franklin, something to the effect that those who give up liberty for security deserve neither liberty nor security. And so here it is. We not only forget the lessons of history, the lessons of other societies, we also forget our own lessons. And we forgot the lesson also that history teaches us and that this country's war of independence as well has taught us. And that is that a nation's force makes it mighty, but it doesn't make it great. It's the values pursued by a nation that makes it a great nation, and not its might or its force. And yet somehow we seem to pursue not only these same arguments, but we seem to pursue them in a manner awfully reminiscent of what we have seen almost every dictatorship do at the initial stages of these dictatorships. How reminiscent is that entire legal structure that we have developed in relationship to the president's power. The president is beyond question. He is the commander-in-chief. He has the right to decree everything, including decide what is and what is law and whether the United States apply to it. Hasn't anybody read about the Führerprinzip in World War II? Isn't that exactly the notion that Hitler sold to a very professional Wehrmacht at the beginning? Swear to me allegiance, I will assume all responsibility. You do not have to assume command responsibility. You can plead obedience to superior orders because I will assume full responsibility. And here we are. And yes, as somebody said during the discussion, isn't there a responsibility for Congress as well? No doubt about it. And then we ask ourselves the question, but look a little bit again at the experience. And the justice case has been mentioned, and may I also remind you of the case also that happened in the subsequent proceedings about the medical experimentations, the doctor's case undertaken by the Nazis. The doctor's cases were cases of torture. And the justice case was precisely the type of case that needs to be illustrated here. What is the professional responsibility of lawyers? As Professor Sadat said here in the Louis XII quote, are the lawyers really the maker of leather shoes? Or because of their standing as a profession, they have a higher professional ethical, moral, legal responsibility. It was fascinating to me, in a way, shocking and maybe hurting, to hear of some arguments about maybe the speakers were somewhat too harsh on Jack Goldschmidt or others. And I can't help think of the very artful compartmentalization of how the entire sequence of event took place. At first, the question was posed to the JAGs, and then when the JAGs' position was not satisfactory, it moved to the civilians. When it was moved to the civilians, each one was responsible for a separate memo on a separate legal issue. So you had Yo, Bybee, Goldschmidt, and then Gonzalez. Each one of them produced a separate document. Now, what is missing in the link here, ladies and gentlemen, is that these memos went to the White House. They went to the President's Council and to the National Security Council. Please do not overlook that link. When these memos went to the NSC, there was, and there is, as always, a legal advisor. Legal advisor, to the best of my recollection at the time, was John Bloomfield, I think, or something like that. He received those memos and he summarized them. He was very careful in summarizing what their contents were. The summary went to the National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, and to Mr. Gonzalez. Gonzalez had already expressed himself on it, so there was no comment or response by him. Condoleezza Rice is reported to have said that it was too legal for her and she couldn't say anything. So the matter was referred to the NSC advisor in charge of democracy and human rights, Mr. Elliot Abrams, who some of you may recall had been formerly convicted and pardoned for engaging in practices involving torture as well. Mr. Abrams found nothing wrong with that, and it passed. Now, the objective of that was to be able, for someone, I don't know who it is, my suspicion is it's the Vice President who went to the President and convinced him to take a position and say, here are different legal positions supporting it. The President took the position. The President is known to be a very stubborn man. The matter was then put on the agenda of the National Security Council, not to be discussed because the President had already made the decision. That's when Secretary Powell knew of it. Again, based on my information, Secretary Powell had a face-to-face meeting with the President, couldn't change the President's mind, and he then wrote a memo saying that he disagreed with that and that this was his understanding as a soldier and not as a lawyer of the applicability of the Geneva Conventions. If you look at these events and you look at the sequence of it and you assume a number of facts which are not publicly known and documents not publicly available, I think you'll come to the conclusion that the compartmentalization was done purposely. That if it was not done purposely, it was done at least with the intention of having plausible deniability. That the whole thing was done in a way so as to get the President to take a position, and knowing the President was a very stubborn man, that the President was not going to change, and it didn't matter afterwards if all of the JAGs in the world would get together and say, oops, this is a mistake. The President would never change his position, and on it went. Now, I happen to have had two additional dimensions to my human experience relating to that. One of them is the fact that I served as the United Nations independent expert for human rights in Afghanistan, and I talked to people who were tortured. And I did see reports of people who were killed under torture in Bagram, in other places. And I've talked to people at the ICRC who were prevented from going to 14 fire bases in which torture was going on. And I have tried to be able to stop the practice. And the result was the U.S. was successful in getting a few European allies and others not to renew the mandate issued by the Commission on Human Rights for me to continue my work. And sooner thereafter, it was announced that the U.S. was going to move a large number of detainees from Guantanamo to Afghanistan and then move them to the custody of the military forces in Afghanistan, which are under the command of the U.S. military and not under the control of the judiciary, so that they can still keep control of the people who may have been tortured or who have been mistreated, so that that information does not go out. I can assure you that there is no way, based on what I have seen, that all of that is done either by mistake, inadvertently, by negligence, or by low-level people. Everything that is done in a way to literally coerce senior officers to look the other way around. And if some of you have any doubt, please review the situation when Secretary of the Army White was dismissed, General Shinseki was dismissed, and close to 30 officers from 2 to 4-star generals were dismissed within a matter of 3 months, all because they disagreed with the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Now, if that doesn't send a chilling message down the chain of command, I don't know what does. I have spoken to the Commanding General of Central Command and to his deputies, and I can assure you that these are honorable officers, but they know their careers are on the line, and they had better look the other way. And so here it is. Everybody is looking the other way. Now, for those of you who read a little bit of history, tell me when it was that a dictatorship occurred in anywhere in the world in which it didn't start by having everyone who had a responsible position look the other way. And then, as enough look the other way, you find that it is very difficult to get back control of the ship of state from those who have exercised these extraordinary powers and who invariably claim they're doing that because of national security. They're doing that because they have a duty to protect us. They're doing that because they're patriots. And those of us who criticize them in the names of our higher principles of constitutionality, democracy, and human rights are the ones who are unpatriotic. So the bottom line is that as we look at the question of torture, I think that we should look at it in a much broader context than the way we have looked at it. This is not only a question of how bad or good and how useful or unuseful torture is. It reminds me of somebody was mentioning John Dean today, but it reminds me of, I think it was John Dean who spoke of a cancer growing on the presidency. We do have a cancer that's growing on our nation, and that is the erosion of our democratic values, of our Constitution, the erosion of our human values, and the erosion of our adherence to the rule of law nationally and internationally. And if we truly want to regain the greatness of this nation, we have to regain the high moral road and give up the low moral road, which will certainly result in much greater dangers to the security of this country, in much greater dangers to the freedom of its citizens and others in this country, and to many other consequential losses, such as the social losses that you have referred to in your question. And so it finally comes down to this. It behooves us, who are members of the legal profession, to take a position, because if not us, then who? Thank you.
quick announcements and then a word of thanks, and then we can adjourn. The first announcement is that there is a reception with hors d'oeuvres and some drinks just in the rotunda so that you can ask more questions and get to know the speakers. The second announcement is that after the reception, the speakers who are staying overnight and the Journal of International Law are going to be meeting for just some informal pizza and beer down at the pub in the basement of the Glidden House. And then finally, I want to ask you all to join me in thanking Cherif Bassiouni and all of the wonderful presenters that we had today, and also yourselves for being such a great audience. Thank you. This conference is adjourned.
Testing 1, 2, check. Checking 1, 2, test. Checking 1, 2, test. 1, 2. Checking 1, 2, test. Checking 1, 2. Testing 1, 2, check. Checking 1, 2.